Welcome to the Daily Ding here on the Athletic NBA Show. I'm Jared Weiss. I am joined by Bay Area columnist Tim Kawakami from the Athletic. Andrew Schlicht is our producer. And Tim, we want to talk about a couple stories you've worked on in the past year that were really interesting. And we're going to start with your column after Game 6 of the first round against the Warriors against the Kings, first round of the playoffs this year, where it looked like everything was falling apart. So take me back to that moment and what you were seeing and how things ended up playing out.
Yeah, that was just unique because I wrote at the time, and it was probably the worst loss, just given the stakes, worst playoff loss in the kind of Steph Curry era. And they've had been eliminated. They lost obviously famously Game 7 against the Cavaliers on their home court, but that was LeBron, the height of LeBron. Obviously a terrible loss, but losing at home when you fought to get up on the Kings when they were down. Remember, they were down to the Kings. With at the tail end, the Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson era, they knew they could just finish it off in Game 6 against the younger, fresher Kings. We know what went on after that, but at that moment was kind of like the circling, like three guys that we knew their legacies aren't at stake, but we knew that this was a very large moment. The team failed in a lot of different ways. And just like you show up to go to the locker room. My rule is you go to the locker room when the locker room is open. You've tried to feel what they're feeling. You try to get the context of their emotions, of the strategies, of just what it's like in there. Doesn't always lead to a lot. That one, walking there, a couple players milling around, but mostly it cleared out by the time we got in there. And the Warriors are unique that even during the regular season, especially the playoffs, they send players one at a time to the podium. So I think most of the people are at the press conference. They're not there in the locker room, although there are people there. I'm not saying it's empty, but that time it was kind of late. Steph, I think, and Klay were the ones who went to the podium, maybe one other player, but not Draymond. But for this moment, for like 10 solid minutes, it was just those three players sitting on their side of the locker room, but pretty far apart. I think 20 feet, their lockers are 4 or 5 people are in between them. But this moment was just those three, just kind of quietly sitting there. They weren't really talking to each other. Klay had the Memphis game on. They're getting destroyed. They're getting blown off the court. He was kind of snickering at that, but they were quiet. And you just, I felt that because I've covered them for their entire Warriors careers, all three of them, through a lot of high points, clearly, through some low points. I know them very well. They know me very well. And it just kind of was the shared moment. And I wrote about it because it felt like that. And this is why I go to stuff. This is why you have this kind of knowledge of personalities and of a team and of the moment and the stakes and what happens if they can't rally here. And it did feel like this was those three kind of starting that process. Like, we got to do this again. This is not what we expected. This is not, a proud group kind of hanging on at the end. And it just was all there. And I wrote it. And the interesting thing is I saw people start texting me and tweeting to me the next day, say, Draymond's quoting you. Draymond's quoting you. I was like, well, okay, what did he say? They tell me the quote. I go, well, I didn't actually write that. I know I thought that. I didn't write that. And it turns out Draymond was quoting me from the Warriors Plus Minus podcast right after the game, speaking about, like, I've been in a lot of Warriors locker rooms. I've been through a lot of things with this. I've never felt that before. And Draymond quoted that, saying, that captured the moment, what he was feeling. It's just like, that's why we're there. That's why we're not at home just writing our thoughts. We do that too. But for the big stuff, for the contextual stuff, for the stuff that means something beyond just one game, one win, one loss, I felt it all right in that moment, to try to capture it, not overwrite it, not be maudlin. But what was there? What did it feel like to be in that moment, in that locker room where fans and readers aren't there? That time, it was important to be there and important to write it like that.
But so what is it like when you write about a player and then that player goes on their own podcast to
Yeah.
react to what you're saying, and you're in this almost like media back and forth
Yeah,
engagement?
the very lightly listened to Draymond Green podcast, right? Like, nobody even listen. I mean, that's like, I just all of a sudden got all like, Draymond's quoting you. Draymond and I have a long relationship, so maybe if it was somebody else, it would be different. But we know each other well. We haven't, sometimes up, sometimes down, mostly good. We have an understanding of each other. So I wasn't surprised. I mean, that he quotes me from a podcast that someone, I don't think he's transcribed the podcast, but someone got it to him. He liked it. He said it. He could have, said something, could have been something negative. I was like, well, maybe I said something negative and Draymond didn't like that. But it just tells you that they felt that you read the moment correctly, and maybe even help them think through that moment a little bit. Because something was happening. Like there was something, and then we all know that the next day, which is the day before Game 7 in Sacramento, Steph Curry calls the team together and has kind of his emotional speech. There was amping up towards that. You could feel that. I didn't know that was coming, and Marcus Thompson, Shams Charania did a great job writing about it after Game 7, and this helps that Steph scored 50 that game, but you could just kind of feel the regeneration going on. And again, I don't know how it was going to end. I don't know that I foresaw them winning Game 7, Steph playing great, but you could imagine that was happening. You could say that, listen, Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson don't lose these moments. They shouldn't have lost Game 6, I should say, but they kind of recalculated, got themselves back ready, and they were determined to win Game 7. And it just felt that in that moment. So when Draymond's quoting me saying it, thankfully it was not a ridiculous quote of mine. Actually, it made sense. You go, okay, that's confirmation of what I felt. Like, and I do feel this, like the experience of being with them informed me about that moment, and they knew I would read it correctly, or they had a pretty good guess I would. And it was like mostly me by myself in there with them for most of this time, because everyone else is talking to the people at the podium. I forget who else would have gone up there, whether it was, Andrew Wiggins or whoever, but it was mostly just me in there and those three in a quiet moment. Pretty interesting, pretty unique. And again, we are there for those. And I don't know what the percentage, Jared, you would say of times we get something like that. It's not very high, but it's 0% if you never go. You never get that feeling if you're not in there. And I do say this to young writers. I say this to readers. I say this to anybody. I say this to editors. This is the important thing about beat writing or column. And I feel like a beat writer myself when I write columns. I do. I associate myself with beat writing. So you're there. You're on hand. It's like, this is different than it was 2 years ago because I was in there 2 years ago. This is different than it was for Game 1 because I was in there for Game 1. This is different than it was, Game 5 against Oklahoma City in 2016 because I was there for that. That all stuff is pretty important. And that's when Draymond is quoting me off of that. It's him acknowledging in a tacit way that I do understand that. And, that's pretty good. It's pretty good confirmation.
Yeah, a huge part of that job when you're a reporter is to have context, to apply context, especially because everybody can see what's happening on the court. You can be there behind the scenes to understand the why rather than the how and the what. And I love the way that you started the piece. It's a technique I like to do. I did it a few times during Boston's insane playoff run this last year about like trying to capture the immediate reaction so that you can then contextualize what they actually say when they go to the press conference after they take a shower. And so I guess how important is it for people to understand like kind of the process a player has of when they're cooling off from the game till they actually kind of gather their thoughts and talk publicly?
Yeah, it's different for each guy, and certainly probably different for veterans as opposed to mid-career guys, opposed to young guys, each within their own world and their own viewpoints. And certainly we're talking about three very veteran players who all have their ways, and I've covered them throughout. I think Klay is kind of more, as you can imagine, he's kind of more shoot from the hip, kind of sitting at his locker and kind of just, saying, watching a game and kind of talking to himself. And then he gets up to the press conference. He says there's similar things. That's why I quoted him mostly in this column, because he's the one who said some things. Because he's Klay Thompson. Like that's terrible. We didn't do what we wanted to do, but we will do better. We're champions. This is what we do. And you could feel that in him, and that's why Klay is beloved for what he does, and that's why he is who he is. He kind of says what he feels. He doesn't really have a kind of editing process. A little bit one, but not much. Draymond did not talk that night, as I recall. He talks most nights, not for most games, but he didn't after that one. I certainly didn't quote him, so I'm pretty sure he didn't talk. But he has his more like, let's just get over with. I'm gonna, maybe I have a statement to make. I'm gonna say something that I know is gonna get a reaction, and then it's kind of like almost like a coach, I would say, but in his, certainly not a coach, but in his Draymond way. But he kind of is a feel. Let's go. This is, I have an emotion. I want to kind of get out there, and I want the players to hear it, and I want the coaches to hear it, and I want the fans to hear it. Like that's Draymond. Like he's the amp up guy. Or the chastise guy, or the emotional. It's the fire. Steph takes a long time. Always takes a long time. He's always kind of, you could just see him kind of thinking through stuff. He might talk, a few words here or there, but he's not like, pacing around. He's just kind of sitting there. You can imagine Steph. He's just kind of sitting there quietly, head down a little bit, maybe eating some dinner, eating a sandwich. Likes a good sandwich. That guy obviously loves popcorn. Takes some time. Often lifts his weights, right after the game. So it takes even longer. Steph is famous for taking a long time, but it's Steph Curry. I always say that's why we're there. So we're going to wait for Steph Curry. And then when he comes out, it's just kind of thought through. It's kind of like, what's going to hit the right note? What do I need to say? You do find yourself like, Steph isn't the most colorful quote, but the things he says are the ones that tend, like the important stuff is what you remember 2 months later or 4 months later. That's when the Warriors did it even after they lose game 6 to the Lakers, another game. They're eliminated, and Steph did say something about, we don't have a changeup offensively. We don't have something different. And they're still, that's why they acquired Chris Paul. Like they're referencing what Steph said right after the game, because it was thought through. It was like an analytical, some emotions, but certainly less than Draymond. So I think, and we know these three guys. I mean, anybody who's watched the Warriors feels like they knows those three guys. I know them quite well. And that was kind of the converging of those three personalities as we've seen on the court, as we've seen in quotes throughout the years. But I think in that moment, they each had their own little thing, but it added up together to what we saw in Game 7. And that's a pretty important, then lead to a championship. But it was pretty instructive of who they are in this moment, who they've been throughout their careers.
All right, so that gets us to kind of the fourth member of the core at this point, Andrew Wiggins. Mm-hmm. And so you had the story right at the beginning of the finals in 2022, which I think was a year ago, but I can't even keep track at this point.
I don't know what it was.
And so we both covered that series, and that series was fascinating because one of the huge matchups coming into it was going to be Andrew Wiggins trying to guard Jason Tatum. And Wiggins was having a big year. This was his chance to really cement his place in the league. And he shut down Jason Tatum completely. And so you enter the series with this huge feature on just the process they got from losing Kevin Durant and all the different trades that kind of came through that to eventually get to Wiggins and Jonathan Kuminga. So I guess walk me through how that story came together and why you structured it the way you did, starting by talking about those kind of chain of events that got them to Wiggins.
Yeah, it's like, as the playoffs are going on, like he's guarding Luka. I mean, the second round, he's got Luka. Like, I'm sorry, it was Western Conference Finals. And that really, like, he's so valuable. We'd been saying it, we've been writing it, fit right into them, personality wise, basketball wise. As the third or fourth guy, it just seemed to fit the chemistry was right. So like, this is interesting. And you just keep thinking they could have lost Kevin Durant for nothing. Like generally in that moment, as a free agent, you lose a guy for nothing. They could have lost him for nothing, could have gone right to cap space. And yet they turned it into sign and trade. They get D'Angelo Russell, and a few months later, they trade D'Angelo Russell for Andrew Wiggins and the draft pick that becomes Jonathan Kuminga. So this stuff is just like, isn't it interesting that they added instead of, this was not a loss. This was an interesting way for them. And how did they do it? Who else does it like this? Where they kind of take D'Angelo Russell's extra money as a way station, knowing it might work, might not work, but if it doesn't work, we know we can flip him immediately for Andrew Wiggins. In fact, we can get Andrew Wiggins and more. And so they're resuscitating Andrew Wiggins' career because we know it was at a very low point. When that trade happened, I think the general thought was the Warriors made a bad trade because you took all this Andrew Wiggins money, older player, not a point guard, who knows what he was. So they get Jonathan Kuminga out of it, and they get out of the luxury tax by dumping two other players to Minnesota and puts Minnesota in luxury tax. Like, how did that happen? Like, you've covered these things. These big moments happen. We do it at the time. And then you kind of learn more. You learn more text to it. You learn, like, what was that phone call like? And the Warriors have been pretty good. And, maybe it's a victory parade. Maybe it's, people maybe it's arrogance, whatever. Joe Lacob, certainly the owner, is not shy about bragging about things they've done successfully, but it's just like it strands, like Kerr saying, when they're up 3-0 over Dallas, like, oh, the key to this has been Andrew Wiggins. That's the key to this. And he was right. It's like, okay, let's thumb through this. It's like, how did that happen? And what move led to that? And it went back, no question, to the franchise was hit pretty hard when they lost Kevin Durant. Obviously, they lose in the finals. Durant has the Achilles tear. Clay is out. What do you do? And what I know about this team, just because I've covered them and know about Joe Lakers, they were like, that night that they lost, they were planning, what do we do? And their big plan. Well, one of them was possibly, can we sign LeBron James, by the way, who was a free agent, did not sign with them. What else do we do? What do we do? Spin. Let's figure it out. And they were able to convince another huge thing. Bob Myers was able to convince Kevin Durant to turn this into a sign and trade. Kevin Durant did not have to agree to that. The Nets did not have to agree to that. But Kevin Durant just felt like, hey, you know what? If I'm going to go, let's let him make this a sign and trade. There was some thought that he didn't want it to just be him for D'Angelo Russell. So they threw a pick. It was just a weird little concoction of things, but it got to the Warriors, D'Angelo Russell. They hold the salary slot. It's them. A lot of teams will say, if we're going to not have Kevin Durant, let's not pay anybody $30 million. Forget that. The Warriors said, you know what? We want to keep the salary. So we want to be able to trade it for somebody. And let's get D'Angelo Russell, let's see what we can do. We can always spin him. And that's the Bob Myers, who has stepped down at the end of last season. Always have another thing you can do once you do something and have that planned out. And I just went through it, talked to Bob Myers, interesting. This was that night they're doing it all was the first night really Mike Dunleavy Jr. shows up on the scene as Myers' kind of lieutenant. He had been kind of a scout until then. So this is another through line because then eventually Mike Dunleavy Jr. becomes Bob Myers' replacement as general manager. But just kind of like, how did they think that? What relationships were important to go through this? Did they really know that they could get Andrew Wiggins once they made the deal Durant for D'Angelo? And they kind of knew. Like, all these things are important parts of this. If you don't know you can move D'Angelo Russell, you probably don't get him because you don't want him because he might not work with Steph Curry, and it did not. And when did they know it didn't work? I'd say pretty early. That wasn't going to work. Russell with Steph, and I just love piecing those things together because that's how the big stuff happens. And if you don't have the kind of the flexibility, you don't have the advanced thinking. Warriors kind of famous for their whiteboards. I would love to get a picture of one of their whiteboards and like, what does 2025 look like? What does 2026 look like? That's how they plan out this stuff. That's how they got Kevin Durant in 2016, by the way, because in like 2014, they started game planning. How would they be able to create that room? How would they get him through the cap spike? All these things that were kind of working in that process. So I've been always on the eye for that kind of thing. What are the 17 steps it takes to be able to flip Kevin Durant into Andrew Wiggins and Jonathan Kuminga when by all rights you could have got nothing for him? When they signed Kevin Durant from Oklahoma City, guess what they gave up? Zero, nothing, because it was cap space, period. Could have happened the same way when they lost Kevin Durant, and instead they turned it into basically the final piece of a 22 championship. Very interesting, just the way they resuscitate players, the way they plan it out. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to do it again. I don't know. The Kuminga part can seem big and can seem not big. He goes up and down, but just kind of this, the blueprint, the kind of behind the scenes look at the way a team going at a very high level puts things together. I think readers love that stuff. And if you can't just all of a sudden decide, I'm going to figure out how this happened. You kind of have to be following it as it goes. And the little nooks and crannies are very important. Like, I didn't even play it up enough. I put it in there, not only, the getting out of luxury tax was huge because it stopped their, repeater to all these things that we know. And they forced that on Minnesota. Like, you've got, not only do we get Wiggins and Kuminga, you got to take these other two players to make sure we get under. Like, that was the final negotiation of this trade. So, I mean, Joe Lacob at the time thinks it was, one of the greatest trades ever, and he gets made fun of it. And I roll my eyes at that one. Come on. I mean, it was, let's see. Andrew Wiggins, who knows? But you think about it, they got a guy who maybe their second best player in the NBA Finals. They do not beat the Celtics without him. Do not beat the Celtics without him. 24 at the time, I think. It's like 26 now. And a perfect fit for you. You get Jonathan Kuminga, who's your shot at, this next generation whenever they get, and you get out of the luxury tax when you could have gotten nothing. Like, this is how you build the next championship team. That's it right there. And so it just kind of was piece by piece, being around guys, talking to guys, getting Bob Myers to call you back when you want to talk about something like that. And he was very willing to do that. And yet, just like having the idea that if I ask him about this, I might get something here. And that's the context. That's the ability over the years to kind of remember this stuff and play it through. And then another random moment is like when they did the Jordan Poole extension last summer or last October. It's like, can you really want to do this? Like, this is a lot of money for a young guy. And Myers said, one thing we've learned over the years is like when you extend guys at decent market rates, you can always trade them. And that's it. It was when they signed, they made offers to, did not sign Harrison Barnes and Festus Ezeli in 2015. They knew that if they just signed him to market rate and they had other guys in that situation, they could get rid of them. Guess what? To make room for Kevin Durant. And I went up to, is that what you meant? Was that Kevin? He goes, yeah, that's it exactly. This is how teams think. It's how they put stuff together. And I'll tell you what, they appreciate it when you understand it. They really do. Like, you got to call them out when they get it wrong. If they screw it up, which the Warriors have screwed up some things, James Wiseman pick, other various things. But when you can kind of follow along the thread and follow along the whiteboard, if you can. I've never seen that whiteboard, but I can picture it. And I have had people describe certain things, part of it. It fills in a lot of blanks for readers and for fans. And I like filling in gaps. I'm curious about it myself. I'd want to know the answer to these questions if I wasn't even writing about it. So happens I can find the answers out and write about it. I have great satisfaction doing stuff like that because you don't always see it. You wonder about it, and you just try to, here's the through line here. Here's the sketch out of how this got to this, and this thing at the end was worth a championship. It might be worth something else down the road. That's the stuff I like to do.
Well, that's what we call light years, folks. He's Tim
No, don't
Kawakami.
put that on me. Don't put that. Yeah, it is what it is. But yeah, they might call that light years. The Warriors might call that light years. That's for sure.
All right, well, we'll see whatever he calls it at the next stop. He's Tim Kawakami, covers everything Bay Area for us at The Athletic. Andrew Schleck's our producer. I'm Jared Weiss. That's my name, Jared Weiss, and we will see you next time on The Ding. And now you have to say ding ding.
I have to ding ding.